finding and rediscovering hobbies and building a community it's a crucial step. And frankly, the community aspect and the people aspect were ones that were really, really shallow for me through that burnout cycle as well. Hi, this is Grant Gurewitz, and you're listening to Expansive Intimacy with Jim Young.
Welcome to Expansive Intimacy. I'm your host, Jim Young, and I'm on a quest to help men like you and me discover how to apply intimacy to unlock new, expansive versions of success in your relationships, your work, and your life. With each episode, we'll take another deep dive into the intimacy toolkit to show you how you can enhance your emotional intelligence, leadership abilities, and relationship skills. So settle in and open up, because it's time to get intimate. Hey folks, welcome to Expansive Intimacy. I'm your host, Jim Young, and you've heard me talk on the show. You've heard my guests talk on the show if you've been listening a few times about burnout. Reason for that is several years ago, I burned out. And in the course of dragging my way out of burnout and recovering from it, that's when I discovered expansive intimacy, or that intimacy created in every area of our lives created a life where you can't burn out because you've got support, you've got places to go when you've got worries, concerns, celebrations, all that kind of stuff. Well, my story of burnout was that I burned out and left the corporate world to go start over because that's what I needed. And that's not the answer for everybody. A couple years ago, while networking with other folks who are working on burnout, I came across a guy named Grant Gurewitz. And I'm excited to have him on the show today. Grant and I have exchanged ideas and thoughts over the last couple of years about different approaches to supporting people with burnout. And one of the things that Grant really focuses on is helping people stay at work. So Grant burnt out in 2016, and he wanted to redefine his relationship with work, but he couldn't find a way. So he developed one. And he now shares how to grow your career while working 38 hours a week or something in that zone. And he does that through his website, School of Logging Off. And I'll drop that link in the show notes. Some of Grant's work has been featured in places like the Wall Street Journal. He's also got a fantastic weekly newsletter. It's one of my must reads every week. It's read by hundreds of employees at companies like Microsoft, Indeed, Google. Grant spent a bunch of time in that tech space with companies like Zillow and Qualtrics for over a decade. And his work reflects the continual evolution of how to work in that new sort of way where you don't have to burn out. You can stay in your job. Grant provides a ton of practical tips. So if you're in a corporate job, you're feeling the singe of burnout, and you're like, hey, I don't want to just up and leave. I kind of like a lot of what I got going on here. Check out today's episode. Grant's got a lot for you, both on the episode and in the resources we'll drop in the show notes. So with that, let's get Grant here onto the show. Grant, welcome back into conversation. I'm excited to connect with you again. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, Jim, thanks so much for having me. Excited to get into it all.
And as you know from our prep before the show, the first question I always ask is, how do you define intimacy?
Yeah, it gets taken a lot of different directions in our society and popular narrative. But in thinking about it, though, to me, it's really when you feel like either you've been let in or you've let someone else in, I think, in a meaningful and deep way is the way that I think about it, where you feel trust and that comfortability and just understanding of a shared human experience with the people that are around you, and you're kind of feeling that sense with, is I think how I would ultimately define it.
Yeah, I get an image of doors there being let in, letting people in. And I was actually having a conversation with our mutual colleague, Kate Donovan, yesterday, and we were talking about boundaries and how, we sometimes open them and sometimes close them as a way to maintain our safety, but also to open up for intimacy. One of the other things that you and Kate and I share is having gone through the experience of burnout. And to ground some of the conversations we're going to have today, I thought it might be interesting to have you share a little bit of your story of experiencing burnout and maybe a little bit of how you're approaching burnout recovery and prevention these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say so. I've been working as a kind of in the corporate tech space for my whole career, over 10 years here now, and really probably about like 4 to 5 years into it, out of college, and as I was kind of getting my legs under me in my career, I really felt kind of an implicit pressure. It was never really stated as an explicit expectation, but this implicit pressure where I saw people around me responding when they were supposedly on vacation and PTO. I saw emails coming in at all hours of the night. So that was kind of my introduction into this corporate workspace where I felt this understanding and this need to, okay, this is how it's done. This is the working life. Plus, coming off of honestly a college experience where you're in class, you're doing internship, like you're working around the clock before you even get into the professional workspace, anyways. I guess it didn't even feel like that big of a shift. It's just that's the way it is. So I got to this point where, yeah, I was working long hours. I was responsible for really stewarding a community for the organization that I worked for that had Facebook posts and messages coming in all hours of the day on the weekends and these sorts of things, which just led to my inability to fully feel like I could log off, or I felt so needed too, where I felt like I couldn't log off for fear that something might happen when I did log off. So I think a lot of those factors kind of all came to a head where I had really one kind of distinct experience, which was, I guess, the straw that broke the camel's back for me, which was I had this lovely sunny Saturday in the Seattle area here where I live. We had some family in town, and I just remember this like really crushing, like big at the time work emergency that just kind of came my way through this community that I was stewarding. And it just like we had executives on email and we were chatting back and forth. And ultimately I had to just like let my family go and explore and do what they were going to do on their own because I got pulled into work. And I was just, that was the moment for me that finally I had the aha moment, I guess, where I just had to understand that, hey, like work has to look different for me.
Yeah, that sounds like the similar to some of my experiences of work, having these implicit expectations that you didn't realize you signed up for, and the door being wide open. For in my case, at least, what I realized over time was that I just didn't say no often enough. I didn't know how to do that, and I saw it all around me. I saw the way to succeed and achieve was to keep up with the after hours messages and all of that. And what a loss for you in that moment, on that Saturday, sunny Saturday, of the kind of connection that we live for. Let me explore this beautiful place that I live with with my loved ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess so I got to the moment where I realized something had to change, but then that opens up the next daunting task, which is how do I even like grapple with that myself? Because like I don't want to like start mailing it in. I don't want to be seen as like this lazy employee. Like I don't want to, I don't know, turn into like kind of this clock punching sort of mentality essentially. And really it was a multi-year journey for me to kind of figure out how do I do both of these things? How do I take care of myself, but how do I also like still find the success that I was looking for in my career? So through, I mean, a lot of trial and error, I tried all of the kind of, I don't know, let's call it lifestyle hacks and waking up at 5 a.m. and journaling and diet and exercise and all of these things. And I mean, I got to even more of like a low point through all of that, which was like on top of like trying to like manage this craziness of work, I was also trying to manage the craziness of like everything outside of work that I was told would make my life easier, but it just made it more complex. And I
Sounds like
felt
more work.
yeah, it was more work. And like, and then I was feeling a lot of guilt too, where I was like, oh, if I slept in till 6 a.m., I was like, well, I really failed myself because I didn't like, uh, didn't, didn't do this plan that I'd set up for myself. So I was feeling a lot of that. And I finally got to the point where first, I think that the first kind of, I guess, piece that really fell into line for me was really getting crisp and clear on how I define success for myself and not how I thought society should define success for me, which is a really clear and important distinction since kind of the typical Western capitalistic mindset of success is increasing title all the time, increasing compensation all the time, and success and identity through your work and kind of all of that. and that it just felt really empty to me at the end of the day. So to me, like I've really started to recast around the idea of like how can I unlock as much control over my time as possible, and that's been a really freeing mindset for me. But it's also taken a lot of practice and understanding with myself on how do I make sure the decisions I make and the things I say yes and no to really ladder up to that definition of success.
Mm. I'm curious how many years it was for you that you were on the burnout spectrum before you got to that place of reckoning with it and saying, wait a sec, this isn't working for me.
It's hard to say. I think there's probably two answers to it. Like I'd
Uh-huh.
say probably again through like a university experience where you're in classes and taking on three other internships and clubs and these things at the same time. So I don't know. It could have like I don't have a great way to answer that. It could be
I
10
know mine
plus
was
years.
like several years. I
Yeah,
often say 5 to 7 years, but I don't know if I actually could put a clear boundary around that period of time.
right. And it's hard since like you like I didn't even like when I had that kind of straw that broke the camel's back moment. Like it's not like I even the realization in my head wasn't, hey, I'm just totally burned out. The realization in my head was like I don't have a good relationship with work. I don't
Hmm.
feel like I even could or wanted to accept kind of that word and that term burnout
Yeah.
with myself for a couple years after the fact, really looking back on it and being like, yeah, that's what this was and putting a label on it.
Same here. I didn't name it as such. I don't think I knew to name it that when it happened to me. And there was a little bit of like, you know, do I want to go down that path? Do I want to label myself that way? And I finally realized like, yeah, that's just what happened to me. And I think that's one of the big challenges I keep seeing and I've run into a lot in my research and done some writing about is and I write about it in particular from a man's perspective, saying there's a certain set of rules that we're expected to live by as men in Western culture. And saying I'm burned out is we're not supposed to say that. Like that's not part of the code for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it kind of comes and plays out as like this sign of weakness in a way, and in
Yeah.
kind of that traditional kind of masculine sort of mindset where, yeah, like you don't want to admit, I guess, defeat, if that's what we want to, or if
Yeah,
that's what.
I can man up my way through just about anything. So like how like work, I had a heavy workload. Like I couldn't handle that. What's wrong with me? I'm not a man. You know, I'm not man enough. It's shameful. And so I'm just going to buckle down and keep working harder. That's how I ended up going up and out in that system of, you know, as you described, always getting the higher title and the higher compensation and you know, our stories diverge a little bit. Like I think our stories are very similar from how we got into burnout and what it was like for us. And I know that you've been able to stay in the corporate world, whereas my path was I got to the top of the ladder and I was like, this is no good. I can't sustain myself this way. And I ended up leaving corporate. I think it's a really important distinction because we don't have to check out to make that kind of change. That's what I needed, but you've done it differently. And I know you teach a lot about this to others and serve as a guide. I'd love to, you know, dive into how you've looked at that relationship with work, as you said, in saying like, okay, I've reached that point where I'm hitting burnout, and how do I now back down into a place that's more sustainable?
Yeah. Yeah. So you're right. So I think our paths definitely diverged at this point. And really that's I would say the popular narrative where you see the TikToks and the Instagram posts and the articles of like, okay, I'm done with kind of this corporate space and now I'm going to get out of here. And like, that's the solve where
Hmm.
certainly I think that's a great, nice solve. I'm sure you run into your own issues still that you have to work with as a kind of an entrepreneur and kind of solo practitioner that
No doubt.
you don't have like a management layer over you necessarily to help kind of keep you in check. So I think
Nor do I
that
have the safety net of the corporation to kind of, you know, feed me work.
right,
Yeah.
right. So I think like that's one piece of it that probably oftentimes gets left out of the story, which is like, okay, the hard and fast solve is just to get out of the corporate space, but you probably don't think about the other kind of negative sides or things that you really need to think about in that case. So that's a big piece of why I've stayed in the corporate space. And as you said, like I think while there's things you have to grapple with and kind of figure out within the corporate space, like there is benefits, there are that safety net, there is coverage when, in theory, when you go out on PTO and vacation, again, in theory. Um, so I think like there's some nice aspects to that. And so really like where I think about how I leverage that and how I've changed like my mindset and relationship with work and been able to effectively do that. For me, like it always starts with really clear and upfront communication with your management team. Pretty much in every business and organization and space, like there's some sort of goal setting activity that happens, whether it's on a yearly basis, a quarterly basis, some sort of regular basis, where that's your time to advocate for yourself, really. Like the business is going to probably put a lot of desire and thought on your plate, essentially. But how do you effectively make sure that those goals are mapped to your bandwidth and what you can realistically take on? And then use those documented written goals as your defense and the place that you're always going to when these things come out of nowhere, and they always do come out of nowhere, new priorities.
Yeah.
To make sure that you're being really sacred with yourself and your time, not because you're like, hey, I have the wall and this is all I can do. I'm always in a place where I'll do whatever you want me to do for the most part, but I just like there's a finite amount of space and shelf space that I can put things on. I don't really care that deeply what's on the shelf. Like I've been going through this exercise right now. There's a project I pitched and I really wanted to have it happen. But then there was a project right behind it that the business decided was the one that was going to happen. So I'm bummed, but I'm not willing to say, well, I feel so passionately that I need to take on both of these things and drown myself, because realistically, neither is going to be a good product then.
Yeah. You use the word sacred, and in that boundary setting around the goals that get created for you, or you work with your manager on, how do you create the room for the sacred? Like, what do you define as kind of on the other side of that wall, like, or the other opposite side of the shelf, to use that analogy? Like, what's the sacred stuff that you're holding space for?
I always look at it as the highest impact work I can put myself next to, essentially. Is it going to have a meaningful impact on the business overall, drive the ultimate goals of the business, connected to what the business cares about, is really the way I think about it. And as you get more experience in your career, like you understand, you can see the things that are like a shiny object for the moment, but like, will kind of fizzle away pretty quickly, or the things that have some staying power that are important. And some of it is understanding the game in your organization a little bit too, which is like, who are the people that are figuring out your raises and promotions and those sorts of things? What do they care about? Making sure you're kind of attached to those sorts of things, as opposed to, I don't know, always like feeling like you need to push your own agenda necessarily. I think you want to have that input. You want to have like that say a little bit, but like know what's hot in the organization, I think, is always an important way to think about it. So you are connected to those kind of magic things that are happening across the organization.
Yeah, I've read so many of your posts and your newsletters that really, I think, do a great job of saying like, I'm going to be really engaged while I'm here. This is really the opposite of quiet quitting, right? It's like, I'm just going to get by and punch the clock, as you said before. It's, I'm going to be flexible within what is really needed and what's interesting. And then I'm going to say, this is my capacity, my bandwidth, because I then want to go on that hike with my family on this sunny, Saturday afternoon or whatever it might be. I'm also just curious, like, what are the things that sit outside of work for you that are the non-negotiables that you have to have?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. Like, so as many companies like going through kind of return to office, and that, I guess, arm wrestling match that's taking hold right now is like there's within the definition of flexibility, there's also some closely related idea, which is this non-negotiable sort of idea, which is how do I make sure that I'm creating that space for those things that I'm not just doing for the sake of it. Like, the way I always would think about positioning it and the way that I talk about it is, if I don't do these things, then you're going to get a lesser me, and you're paying me for my creativity, my knowledge, my brain. And if my brain is like working at half capacity, like you're just not getting the best out of me. So the things that I need to do to go recalibrate and rejuvenate and fill my cup, so to speak, is going to be the things that actually make me a far better asset to the organization anyway. So I'll kind of put that initial caveat in there. But I living in the Pacific Northwest, like a lot of things outdoors it's everything to me. Especially in the summer in the nice weather, I kayak, I build a vegetable garden in my yard, which for me is such a nice midday break where I can just kind of go out there and water the plants and spend 10, 15 minutes doing that and have no screen in front of me. And while I'm not actively engaged in work during that time, it allows my brain to kind of go to that really magic place that it loves to go to, where it can kind of chew through some of those big ideas anyways. So even though I might not be actively sitting in front of my computer, kind of producing the widgets, so to speak, of my job, like again, I'm getting paid for my brain and my knowledge, and to effectively create that, I need that magic kind of brain space to do so.
I think that's critical. There's a story that I heard years ago. I think it was an NPR radio spot. I'm not going to remember the details, but talking about the neuroscience around how we get these aha moments when we're driving our car home from work, or we're walking around the grocery store, or we're in the garden. And it's because our brain is actually operating in a different mode, and it's consolidating information and it's making connections. And that time that might seem in a really traditional 9 to 5 punch the clock, production oriented corporate mindset as frivolous, like you're going outside for 15 minutes to weed and water your garden, it's work time. It actually can be super productive, and to help create that understanding within the organization, which sounds like a little bit of what you're up to, is helping folks understand, like, hey, here's how I can show up at my best. And I'm also curious, if you were to rewind back to, when you're managing that Facebook community and you're kind of at the peak of the work pressures that you were feeling, I'm curious, to what extent did you understand what was on that list of non-negotiables for you outside of work?
I didn't understand them at all. I didn't even register that as a concept in my mind. And again, I think it goes back to what we were talking about, which is, for so many of us in our society, is like, to get into college, you have to do these extracurriculars. To be in college, you have to take on these internships to get a job. Mm-hmm. And then it's just become so normalized that, like, oh, what is recovery time? Like, what does that even mean? What's that good for? Yeah. Like, you're wasting hours that could be productive and, in theory, valuable to something else during that recovery time. So I think a lot of it is like reframing the mindset that I'm not taking time away from work to be lazy or that I'm incompetent. It's that I need that to be the best, not just person I can be, but for my organization, the best employee I can be too.
Hey, I've brought my stress level down. I maybe didn't look productive, but I was being valuable. So I heard you say productive and valuable. I'm like, oh, those are two different things sometimes. There's certainly an intersection. And to bring it back to intimacy, for me, one of the things that I'm going to guess at a little bit here is being in such a beautiful place as you are, and enjoying being out in nature, whether that's in your kayak or on a trail or in your garden, is that I think of nature as like one of the best spiritual cathedrals there is. And there's this spiritual intimacy, this connection with something much bigger than ourselves that calms us down and gives us resources to be able to go back into the busyness and the productivity that we're asked to do at work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's tons of research to back that up, but a quote that I heard recently that just resonated so much with me, which is this idea that if you're working with your brain, you need to rest with your hands. And I mean, what that can be defined as is getting out there, like not being in front of a screen, honestly. Like my body's physically resting during my workday. And my brain's exhausted. So oftentimes after the end of a busy work week, what you think is what you might need is just time to sprawl out on the couch and order in delivery or something like that. And that might be true a little bit. Like, we certainly need to sleep and we need rest, but a lot of times what we actually need to and fail to understand and turn to is that time to get out and allow your brain to rest, but your body to kind of do the work, and that helps kind of equal out the equilibrium that we all have, I think, and the needs that we have. But it's a lost concept. But I know that, like, frankly, I spend a lot of time looking at some of this research, and there's a lot of city planners that are doing really important work right now to understand, like, how close you live to a park and tree canopies and like all of those things, like close to where we live, as a way to help make us better people, and having those sorts of things very, very easily at our disposal and walkable too.
There are a couple of things that come to mind on that for me. There's a study that I heard about that talks about how the like fractal geometry, I think it was the term, fractal geometric shapes of nature actually have this soothing effect on our brains just by walking around in nature. It's nothing we even have to try to do. We can regulate ourselves by just being out looking at the shapes of nature. And the other is a book called Burnout. I can't think of the subtitle, by Amelia and Emily Nagoski. It was one of the first books I read on burnout. It's written specifically to talk about women's experience of burnout. And one of the brilliant things they list in there are the 7 ways that we can complete a stress cycle. And that's somehow in the subtitle of the book I'm remembering. And exercise is the number one way that we complete stress cycles in our bodies. That we sit in the work day at our office or wherever, and we're dealing with stress of different types than we were wired for originally. You know, an email interaction with a colleague or a customer that's really stressful. We don't have ways of getting that out of our systems that are built into the workday. So getting out after work and paddling or running or working out or just being physical in whatever way has a profound effect on our bodies and lets us get through that stress cycle so that we can show up again, you know, at our best for the next round.
Yeah, absolutely. And it helps, like, all those concepts seem to always melt away by the end of whatever activity you've done. And while what felt like a really big deal before you started your outdoor exercise, nature activity, whatever it is, by the end of it, it's like, it just doesn't feel as big of a deal anymore. And it helps kind of, yeah, ground you based on helping you feel smaller in a bigger world, which is a weird way to put it, I think. But it's just like, whatever this email was that kind of lit your hair on fire in that moment, like, you get out. And I remember last year I took like a long bike ride. We have a great trail in the Seattle area that just kind of goes through the mountains for miles and miles and miles. And just by the end of it, I like, all that stuff melted away. I had ideas and kind of solutions to all the big problems, right? And it just, like, you feel like, by putting yourself in to be kind of almost an ant, right, in like this larger ecosystem, it just makes those big problems and right sizes them into a smaller problem in a way that you can kind of tackle them going forward, I think.
I often think about rest, recharge, retrain as a pretty good structure for dealing with work stress or any kind of stress that might be leading us towards burnout. And I want to add reframe into that now because it fits with the pattern. And that reframing of like 3-hour bike ride out in nature, the context I now have, the perspective I have on that thing that I thought was monumental. I'm like, oh, there's an answer, and it's not actually this catastrophe that I maybe was working it up into being by removing myself from the situation a little bit. One of the other things I wanted to explore with you, Grant, is you've written about work as having, in many cases, an inherent transactional nature, which to me is very much the antithesis of intimacy, because we're looking at really open relationship and connection and revelation that feels very different to me than transactional work. And I'd love first to hear what you've shared in other places around why that transactional nature of work might actually be a good thing.
Yeah, it's an important point to make. And I think we hear transactional, and I think we immediately then think of kind of that clock punching mentality. And it's just, you're mailing it in, you're going in, doing the bare minimum, kind of that quiet quitting sort of idea. To me so there's a foundational understanding, which I think has come to light over the last year as layoffs have been happening, where your company kind of expects you to give your all and devote your life and your sense of identity a lot of times to that company. And frankly, that company's not afraid to turn around on a dime and kind of without expectation, have you not there the next day. So I think like we have to take that morbid place a little bit to give ourselves perspective and context and understanding. But at the end of the day, I, as you mentioned, like I really think about like how can you go in, do the job and around the goals that you've set out that are connected to the high impact work, do the very best you can do at that, but then give yourself permission to leave and not feel like I need to get sucked in, and just because it might be 3:30 on a day or just 4 o'clock and feel like, oh well, I have to get to 5 and I have to fill my time with something else. I don't think it has to be that way. I think you have to give yourself the freedom to again do really high impact work in a high quality way and then be done with it. And that's the only way to really save your sanity and continue to show up really effectively day after day after day without going down this kind of spectrum of exhaustion and fatigue and burnout and kind of this hamster wheel cycle that I often think about that I see people go on, which is like, okay, I'm crawling to my next vacation and then I have a chance to kind of recharge for a little while and then I get right back on it. And then I don't know, 4 months later or 7 months later, whenever I have my next vacation, you can see them just like barely crawling to the finish line to get to that vacation that they have planned. Like, yes, we need vacations. We're going to be tired leading up to those probably, but like, how do you build your speed and kind of the pace that you're going at in a sustainable and manageable way?
Mm. And that made me think of something you talked about earlier. I want to come back to the idea of success, and that hamster wheel effect that we get is oftentimes chasing success. If I just did more, I could get that promotion. If I, was the employee of the month, it would mean a lot. And it's a very focused way that our society has put on success, that your work becomes such a huge marker. We go to a cocktail party. What do? We really place a lot of emphasis on that. And I've been focusing a lot on this notion of expanding what success means for us. And it sounds like that's something that's near and dear to you as well. I'd love to just hear like how you break down success in your life these days with work. And I'll bring in one of my favorite tools for my work as an improv comedian is this yes and it, right? Like, yes, my work is a core source of how I feel successful in the world. And I'd love to hear what that model looks like for you.
Yeah, it's a great point. I'd say the first, I guess, place that I got to in my head was I work in marketing. I do not have the career aspiration of becoming the chief marketing officer or like a VP of marketing necessarily. Like, that's not my career aspiration, to continue to climb that corporate ladder. The dangerous game that you describe of like continuing to chase, because to use the kind of the football goalpost analogy, like it's going to continue to move on you and you're never going to get there.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, like
I got this chief marketing officer, but it was only of a $30 million company. I need to be in a Fortune 500 company.
Exactly. There's all like you're still going to feel inferior, that there's a bigger goal after the one that you achieve. And so it's hard to even feel like happy after you achieve that goal, because then you're already kind of like, well, what's the next one? And so there's a dangerous cycle there.
Yeah.
To me, like I still take great pride in my work. Like I want to be the best employee that I can be. I'm working on a promotion cycle for myself for over the next year. And how do I get to that place? So like, I still want to have some of those traditional markers of success, and those are meaningful to me. But again, the ability for me to control my time and not be the first line of defense always, if there's like some work emergency that's happening, I'm not getting pulled into the Friday night meeting to deal with these sorts of things, because that just doesn't add to my life. Like, that's not the type of excitement that I want to be a part of and how I think about success. Yeah. Some people really thrive in that space.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's not the place that I want to be. I think there's an important additional mindset, which is around like identity, where when I was in like kind of the core of my burnout cycle, like work was my life. It's how I define myself. It's how people viewed me. So of course I worked like that. Like, that's all I did, because that was my identity. as I've started to think of myself first and foremost as a husband, as a gardener, as a bike rider, as like all of these other things, I have things to turn to now, which I think is really important and critical for me, where I'm not just filling my cup with work. I'm not just turning to work to fuel my identity. I have other things that are going to pull me away, whether it's things, activities, loved ones, all of that. So having those other things and finding and rediscovering hobbies and building a community has been, it's a crucial step. And frankly, the community aspect and the people aspect were ones that were really, really shallow for me through that burnout cycle as well.
Same here. And then identifying that ultimately for me was what helped me recover most was to build social support around me.
Absolutely. Because I moved to the Seattle area after college, without growing up here, without any real sense of community or people that I really knew here as my now wife and myself. And I really went in living in this area. I mean, getting really vulnerable, like really with no local friends for many, many, many years. I had good, like, social colleagues that we grabbed happy hour after work. Like we spent social time together and I enjoyed, but like, I don't know, like there's no one who I'm a big baseball fan. Like I had no one to call to be like, hey, you want to go catch a game with me or something like that. And that was really hard for me for a number of years. And I've taken to really thinking about how do I build that social connection near me. And I've been working really hard to grow that out and think about how I do that. Because making friends as an adult is hard, and I don't have kids, so there's not like the kid community to kind of go to. So that piece was frankly like one of like the last and hardest challenges actually for me to overcome, to feel like I kind of had like all of these the things to turn to to keep me out of this burnout cycle.
It's a really common thing that I hear a lot in the guys that I work with. And if you haven't seen the Saturday Night Live Man Park skit, go check that out, because it's hilarious and it's sad and hilarious. I'd love to just get one quick tip of like, or piece of advice that you might have around how do guys make friends in their adult years? What's worked for you?
Yeah, to be honest, and not an advertisement at all. So the Bumble app has a BFF feature inside of the app, so a non-dating aspect, and it's been a way to put yourself out there and in kind of the modern space of making human connection. Like it's been a good place for me actually to make a couple local friends and connections and feel like I have that group of people that I can go on a hike with, go to a game with, and all of that.
I love it. That's great. It's not something that I would think of. And what a great use of that technology. It's already designed to get people together. So getting people together in friend groups. So there's one tip, guys. If you're looking for friends, you can get on. You just make sure your partner understands if you're in a relationship, why you got Bumble on your phone.
Yeah, you can turn off the dating side of it and everything like that, but still, a little jarring if you don't have that conversation beforehand. If she sees your Bumble app on your phone.
Yeah, we don't want to disrupt that level of intimacy that you might have going on. Grant, I would love to also just give you a little bit of space here as we wrap up to share a little bit about what you got going on in the world. Because I know you've been working on some amazing projects. And, I heard a model that you described just a bit ago of getting to know yourself, setting a longer term plan for what identities you want to be living into, and then creating shorter term plans to get there. And I know you've done that around some projects outside of your typical corporate work. And I'd love for you to share that, because I think you've got some great resources out there for folks, especially who are trying to find that right mix between work and, being able to get away from it.
Yeah. And I appreciate you giving me the space to talk about it, because it's a place that I've been writing and thinking about for a number of years. I've written some form of a newsletter for quite a while, but the project and the way that I think about this and what I launched earlier this year is this concept and website called schoolofloggingoff.com. I have a weekly newsletter called Sustain that I send out, which is all around these ideas that we've been talking about. How do you effectively redefine your relationship with work, log off more. Like that's the end product I think that we all want out of all of this, but do it in a way where you keep a corporate job if that's what you need or want, and you can still find those traditional measures of success. I think it's been so binary in the way that a lot of people talk about it, where you're either quiet quitting and doing the bare minimum, or you're working 80 hours a week, constantly chasing this thing. But no one really talks about what happens in the middle. Yeah. And that's the place that I really want to solve for, and the gap that I see in what's out there is a way to still find the raises, the bonuses, the connection to work. Like I still feel connected to my work, even if I do think of it more transactionally. But I want to help show people how to find that, how to unlock the mindsets needed to do that, and also some more kind of tactical areas of getting to log off and getting how do you recalibrate and rejuvenate yourself outside of work. And just one little thing that my community has loved over the years is this concept called 3 good pockets, which is this idea of like there's a huge number of boulders in your day that are pretty unmovable and you're kind of stuck with, but the old analogy of like, then you put the sand and the smaller rocks over the boulders. Yeah. Like there's always going to be space to find 3 pockets in your day, essentially, where even if it's as simple as making yourself a piece of toast and you're just like literally taking a moment for yourself, or watering the plants, or reading, or doing something that brings some sense of meaning to you. Like there's space to do 3 little things. There's 3 pockets every single day. So that's a tip in a framework that my community has really loved over the years.
I love that. I hadn't seen that. And I've been a fan of Grant's work for a couple of years. His resources are fabulous, really relatable, really practical and actionable, as well as some of those big mindset shifts that are really at the foundational layer of how we do change our relationship with work and get to that spot in the center of the pendulum that you described, that we can be engaged without it consuming us. We can get meaning without overdoing it. Really love everything that you're doing, Grant. And thanks again for coming on the show today.
Yeah, it was great to chat with you, Jim.
All right. And we'll put a bunch of links in the show notes for folks so you can make sure that you can find Grant. And we hope you got a lot out of today's episode. Tune in next week as well.
Hey guys, it's Jim. Thanks for listening to the show. If you're enjoying these episodes and are wanting to bring a little bit more of those relational skills into your work and your life, get in touch. I keep a couple of slots open for one-on-one coaching with guys to help them develop their emotional intelligence, their relationship skills, their leadership ability, all so that they could live the most successful and happy lives possible. Just email me at jim@thecenteredcoach.com and we can have a short call to see how I might be able to help you. Hey, thanks for tuning in today. I really look forward to seeing you next week on Expansive Intimacy with me, Jim Young. I'd also love your help with expanding intimacy even further. Will you take a minute right now to rate the show and write a review? It's the best way for us to bring more people into the conversation. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.